And welcome into the crossover podcast between the Bama On3 show and Dawg Walk Talk. This is your host, Clint Lamb, sitting here with Palmer Thombs. Palmer, how you doing today, man?
Doing well, Clint. Looking forward to previewing this game. Certainly excited to get to Atlanta here before too long, and excited to see these two football teams match up at Mercedes-Benz Stadium on Saturday.
It's a different feel, isn't it? I mean, you're talking out of all the times that Alabama and Georgia have played, there have been, I don't think there are very few of those matchups where people weren't giving Georgia a chance to win, but the expectation was that Alabama was going to come out on top. This year, it would shock everybody. Georgia fans, even a lot of Alabama fans, anybody in the media who's completely unbiased, I think it would pretty much shock just about everybody if Alabama came out with a win. So very different feel than what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, we were talking about it off air for a sec before we got started, but the thing that's different about this Georgia team than others is the leadership, the desire to win this game, the single-minded focus of, hey, they'll never admit it, but a lot of these seniors, whether it's Jordan Davis, Devontae Wyatt, James Cook, Zamir White, they came back to win this game. They came back for another shot at Alabama, another shot at an SEC championship, another shot at a national championship. I think that it didn't sit well with them. And I think Florida would also be on that list too. I don't think the last year's two losses to Alabama and Florida didn't sit well with them. They knew that those were two of Georgia's rivals, and that, losing to Florida meant that Georgia didn't get another shot at Alabama in the SEC championship game. I think if Georgia had gotten a second shot at Alabama last year and they had lost, then a lot of these guys would have been like, well, hey, we gave it our best shot. We got to play them 4 times in our college careers, and so be it. But I think a lot of those guys saw this game as their off-season motto when decision season came around and they were all making their announcements to come back, that a lot of them were putting hashtag unfinished business, and I think it's very clear what that unfinished business is. It's Alabama, it's an SEC championship, it's a national championship, and so far so good for them. I mean, 12-0 regular season. They have looked pretty dominant. Haven't played a game within 14 points, I think 17 points since the season opener against Clemson. And, the defense has carried its weight. Offense has stepped up, with an unexpected leader. And right now it seems like everything is clicking for the Bulldogs.
Yeah, it really does. And what's interesting about the entire thing is that, sometimes you see a team start to progress over the course of a season, and it starts to feel like, I can remember back in 2009 with Alabama, it really started feeling like a team of destiny. With LSU in 2019, really felt like a team of destiny. Even going into that Alabama LSU game where it was kind of a toss-up on who was going to win, you just felt like there was a part of you that thought, LSU has a very good shot to win this football game. And if they beat Alabama, I think they're winning it all. And they will continue to be flawless. And I kind of approached this game in the same fashion where, it feels like that Georgia's just that much more ahead of everybody right now. So the expectation is that they're going to beat Alabama on Saturday. But if they're able to do that, I don't really see anybody else in the college football playoff, whether it be Michigan, Oklahoma State, Cincinnati, really, anybody that's going to be able to, stay competitive with Georgia once the college football playoff rolls around. Now, any of them can beat Georgia. Granted, if the good part about this is if the college football playoff started a week after playing Alabama and they're able to get some kind of huge emotional win and get that monkey off their back, then I could see a letdown game potentially the next week. But the fact that you're going to have so much time between the SEC championship and when the college football playoff actually starts, I think that bodes well for their chances to get their minds right and get ready for a national championship run if they win on Saturday.
Yeah. I think that you have that caveat of if they win on Saturday, because to me, like you said, going back to that LSU team in 2019, if they beat Alabama there, they felt like a team of destiny. They had to get over that hurdle. That was certainly a hurdle for LSU and that program. And they got over it. And then it felt like, okay, hey, this is an unstoppable force that is inevitably moving towards a national championship. It feels that way with Georgia, that they have this big hurdle that they've got to get over. It's been a hurdle for Kirby Smart, in his 6 seasons here. This will be the 4th time that he's played Alabama. He's 0-3 so far, but he's 3-0 at leading at halftime. And so, I think when you look at the dynamics there, I think that it is this big hurdle that you've got to get over, this emotional game. These players, again, will say over and over, this isn't another game. This is just another game. This isn't any bigger than any other one. The stakes are bigger. You raise a trophy at the end of it if you win it, but that the opponent doesn't change it. To me, I think it does. I think that in the back of everyone's minds, it absolutely does. And that there's that emotional factor to this game. Clint, in terms of from the Alabama side of things, we've talked a lot about Georgia so far. How do you see Nick Saban's team coming into this game, off of an emotional win of their own in the Iron Bowl, having to play 4 overtimes and come back and lead an emotional drive, Bryce Young with the emotional drive to tie the game, send it to overtime. And then obviously the way that it played out there, how do you see Alabama coming into this game, coming off of that emotional game?
Well, first of all, I think all season you've had an Alabama team that has not only been inconsistent, I think that would be the first word that I would use. It just feels like that both sides of the football can't play well at the same time, whether it's offensively or defensively, even in the course of one game. One of them's playing strong to start the game. The other one's, the defense is giving up points. The offense is scoring points, but then the offense starts to stall out and then the defense starts playing well. And I think that's where you've gotten a lot of your close games because both sides of the football can't, get on the same page and play well at the same time. If you do see Alabama do that, and it's possible that you could still get that against Georgia, you could get that in the college football playoff or a bowl game. But, in games where they've been able to do that, which has been very limited, you get the Mississippi State outcome, a 49-9 victory, completely dominant on both sides of the football. You go to Starkville to get that win. Probably the most impressive that Alabama's looked all season. The problem is that they can't, keep that consistency going. And you look at that, Auburn game on Saturday, what'd you see? You saw the defense being completely dominant, which was expected. You got a limited passing attack with TJ Finley, Tank Bigsby. When you're having to be one-dimensional, that's going to make things a lot more, a lot easier on your defense. But you saw the defense playing extremely well with the offense. I don't think that I've ever seen an Alabama offense, at least during the Nick Saban era, play as poorly as they did for, at least 3.5, closing in on 4 quarters. It went into those last couple of minutes with that last final drive that they were finally able to get something going. And that's what worries you. But the problem is that I think a lot of people in this particular matchup, they assume what they got on Saturday is what they're going to get this coming Saturday in the SEC championship. And I think that was more of an anomaly, Alabama's on the other side of things now, going into that game on paper, there were very few. In fact, there were really no reasons why you would be picking Auburn to win that football game. And I think that was a different approach. This week, you're really struggling to try to find reasons that on paper that Alabama's going to beat Georgia. And so I wonder how that's going to affect things because in the past, Alabama's not used to being on this side of things. And I'll say this from my perspective and just covering Alabama, I think it's been a nice little change of pace. And I think it's been kind of fun, going into a game, not being entirely sure, it's very possible they could get run out of the stadium. But at the same time, that makes it a lot more exciting covering it leading up to it because, there is this unknown factor and there's some excitement with that.
Yeah. I mean, you were saying that anytime you've done any sort of crossover podcast, any crossover show that, more often than not, you're going in trying to think, well, how can your team stay in it? How can the team that you cover stay in it? And now it's, well, how can the team that I cover stay in it for you?
Yeah. And that's really a huge change of pace for me. It's really trying to, it's kind of like the Nick Saban approach. You don't want to be disrespectful, and you certainly don't want to, get a crossover podcast going and being like, I think we're going to completely, trounce, your team on Saturday. That's never the approach that you want to take. But in a lot of cases, I mean, that's what's going on in the back of your head. In this game, it's really, in some ways, it's trying to keep the Alabama fan base happy and saying, hey, don't count yourselves out of it, because I do think there are things that Alabama can do to make it a lot more difficult on Georgia. I think there's some things that they could show Georgia that Georgia hadn't dealt with. I think with Georgia's offense, with the way that their defense is played, they've been able to step on the football field and every drive, there's zero pressure to put up points. And I think that they're certainly capable of rising to the occasion. We just haven't had to see it a lot. So if Alabama can put any sort of pressure, offensively, get a big break, I do think that Alabama takes a lot of chances early. You don't have as much to lose in this game as in some of the games in the past. Then maybe that can change the approach of how Georgia's responding to it. But it is a very different way of covering this football game than really anything that I've experienced since I started covering Alabama 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah. And so I guess when you say that this is so different and that you looking at this on paper, it's, Alabama, Georgia should beat Alabama on paper. What is it that's the biggest difference? Because, you look back at the last 3 matchups between these two teams, even when Georgia was the higher ranked team, higher seeded team in that 2017 game for the national championship, Alabama was still the favorite. Alabama hasn't been an underdog since 2015 when they played Georgia, and that's the only time this decade. So, what is it to you that stands out what is it that stands out to you about Georgia that is causing this, change in the tides?
Well, I think when you look at Georgia, whether it's offensively or defensively, you find very few limitations. You find very few areas that you can exploit. I think one of the questions that you asked is where can Alabama attack Georgia offensively? And really looking at that, there's not a lot of areas that I think that they can. Now, granted, Alabama's a much better run defense than I think people realize. They haven't allowed a running back to have a 3 yards per carry average, or really a run game in general to average 3 yards a carry. Since that Texas A&M game, they've been very efficient and very effective stopping the run, with Georgia being predominantly a run team. Now, granted, they're not as much one-dimensional as people would assume with Stetson Bennett at quarterback. He's a completely different quarterback this year. I think he's been very efficient. I think he can throw the ball downfield a lot better than people realize. But they still are, I would still say they're probably a predominantly run-heavy offense. I think that bodes well for Alabama. Now, Georgia, on their side of things, they're also very good at stopping the run. The problem is that I think Alabama's going into this game assuming that the run game is just not going to be there due to the injuries at running back. I mean, Alabama has now lost, Jace McClellan, Roy Dell Williams, Brian Robinson Jr., and then the 5-star running back, the true freshman, Kamar Wheaton. He hadn't been available all year. So out of 5 scholarship true running backs, they have one right now, and it's Trey Sanders, who's coming off of an injury. He was involved in a pretty bad car wreck last year. I still don't think he's fully 100%, but now he's the only, quote unquote, healthy running back. And it's possible that Brian Robinson plays, and he might play just out of, sheer necessity, as long as he doesn't run the risk of injuring himself further. But you've got a converted wide receiver in Christian Leary, and now playing running back. You got a converted linebacker in Demoy Kennedy. Those guys have gotten some action and mop-up duty, but don't really, I don't think you're going to rely on them too much. And I also don't think you're going to give Trey Sanders 25 or 30 touches. So I think going in, Alabama already understands they're not going to have a lot of success running the football. The problem with that is I think if you want to have success against Georgia, you need to be able to, attack them in a variety of ways. You can't be too one-dimensional against a defense that's effective at all 3 levels of the field. And so that's what, I think, plays into Georgia's favor quite a bit, is that, I think that Alabama just adopting that philosophy going in and not trying to force the run game when it's probably not going to be there anyways. I think in some ways that can help them, but also just simply being one-dimensional, Georgia's going to be able to play off of that and do some things. I mean, Alabama hadn't really run a screen game too much. They haven't tried to throw defensive or pass rushers off too much. I think in this game you have to, because otherwise, with the lack of a run game, Georgia's going to be able to pin their ears back and assume, we're getting after the quarterback on pretty much every play. And I think that does not bode well for Alabama going against that offensive line.
Yeah, I think that, like you said, the best way to beat this Georgia defense is to be, as close to 50-50 balanced as possible. You have to have the threat of both, because if you don't have the threat of one, then they can just pin their ears back and say, hey, we're going all out to stop the other, whether that's the run game or the pass game. And like you said, with Alabama's, limited depth at running back, it would appear that the reliance is going to be on the passing game. The pressure is going to be on Bryce Young, which means that the Georgia is going to do whatever they can to put the pressure on Bryce Young. You going back and watching that Iron Bowl, you see the way that Auburn was able to affect Alabama and the pressure that they were able to put on him, how uncomfortable he looked at times in the pocket, and it's not just limited to that Auburn game. LSU and Arkansas and Texas A&M all had 4+ sacks against Alabama. And so if there's one thing to me that stands out in terms of Georgia's defensive game plan, it would be that reliance to put pressure on them. Nolan Smith, Robert Beal, Trayvon Walker, those guys coming off of the edge, but you've also got guys in the middle like Channing Tindall and Nakobe Dean. Inside linebacker leads the team in sacks. And I don't think that's something that you are seeing too often in college football these days. Georgia has been able to generate pressure naturally this year. In years past, Kirby Smart has been very reliant on man-to-man defense and bringing blitzes at the proper times. Well, this year he's transitioned to more of a zone approach on the back end. I think that if you're going to try and match up with Alabama, that's the way you do it. You can't just rely on man-to-man to go against guys like Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle. You saw what it did to him last year. You saw what it did to him in 2018 as well, and 2017, or I guess 2018, but both 2018 games. Georgia got beat deep. It really cost them in that national championship game with the game-winning play there to Smith. It cost them, last year with Waddle having a big play. Jerry Jeudy had some big plays against Georgia in 2018 as well. And so I think that with athletes like that, with athletes like Jamison Williams and John Mechie, and you can't play man-to-man and just rely on your ability to go one-on-one with those guys. You have to have a team approach to it. And that's how Georgia has changed up its defense this year. They've gotten pressure naturally based on the athletes that they have in that front seven, and they've let their athletes play in the back end, and say, hey, if we're going to get the pressure naturally, we don't need to bring the pressure. We can bring, a 4-man rush, a 5-man rush, and drop some guys back into coverage and help on the back end there. So I think that what Georgia has done this year is they haven't given up the big plays. I think that if there is a way to beat them, it would be, trying to hit on some of those big plays. And like you said, I think Alabama takes some shots early. You look back at a couple of games, the teams that have scored the most on Georgia this year, they have been able to hit some of those big plays. Josh Vann from South Carolina had a couple of big plays, but Georgia has really tightened it up since then. That was the third game of the year, and that has been kind of an anomaly. Tennessee had some big plays that they were able to hit on. Cedric Tillman had a big game for them. And so, I think if there is a way to beat this Georgia defense, it would be on the passing game, just in, by sheer chance that you are able to get, a one-on-one matchup or a DB falls down or something like that. So I think that is where Georgia, is maybe a little bit susceptible, but at the same time, it's been a strength where they've been able to keep you in front of them and say, hey, if you're going to drive down the field, we're not going to let you hit on one big play and get behind us. We're going to keep you in front of us. And as you pick up yardage, that's just less yardage that we have to cover. As you get into that red zone, the red zone defense has been pretty great at forcing field goals.
Yeah. What's interesting is, first of all, can relate as far as Cedric Tillman being able to create some big explosive plays downfield. He was able to do that quite a bit against Alabama. The question that I had for you, because going in, I know that Georgia has played a lot more zone than normal this year, but based off of a lot of the passing attacks they've gone against, you really didn't have a lot of teams that can threaten you vertically consistently. And what's interesting is that when Alabama has struggled, getting things going offensively, and they're looking for that spark or that momentum to really get things rolling, a big pop play to Jamison Williams downfield has been the spark multiple times on multiple occasions throughout the season. I do think that that's a similar approach. And what we didn't get to see is with him getting, ejected last week for targeting against Auburn, we didn't get to see that opportunity where they could have gotten the offense rolling a little bit earlier, by taking the top off of their defense and really loosening things up a bit. Do you think that Georgia plays a little bit more man because they actually are going to be threatened vertically a little bit more against Alabama than maybe we've seen up to this point, instead of having that zone coverage and kind of keeping things in front of you. John Mechie excels in the short to intermediate stuff. So I definitely think that, being weary of that is important, but also with John Mechie being, as good of a vertical threat as he is. And, we did see Cedric Tillman have a little bit of success, pushing vertically as well. Do you think we see a little bit more man coverage?
I think it's going to depend. I think that if you go back and you watch that Tennessee game where Georgia made its changes, the first 3 drives, Tennessee put up 10 points and was leading after the first quarter. It's the only team that has led on Georgia at a quarter break this season. They were up 10-7 there. And I think that where we saw Georgia make changes was in the secondary, that they did, play a little bit more man. They tried to run with these guys. So I think that you could see Georgia play a little bit more man. I don't think that, you haven't seen over the past couple of years, you haven't seen Kirby Smart drastically change his defensive game plans coming into a big game like this. And I think that it has cost them at times, because they have been out athleted, beat by guys like we mentioned, the Alabama receivers of the past, and also the LSU receivers in 2019. We're talking about very generational talent guys there, but let's not act, it's not like Alabama doesn't have generational talents this year. Jamison Williams has been, one of the best receivers, if not the best receiver in the country this year. And so I think that you do have to take a little bit of a different approach. I think that, if you're Georgia, you don't want to change up too much because you have been so successful. But I think that you do have to pay special attention to guys like Williams and Mechie in this game.
Well, and what I think, offensively for Alabama, I'll tell you right now, and what's interesting is that I'm not entirely convinced that they're going to make changes, but I think that you have to if you want to have success against Georgia. They can't run that, putting Bryce Young in a position where he's got to make a lot of checks and reads the line of scrimmage pre-snap. I think that right now that has created a lot of communication issues. There's too much that you're trying to do. You're doing way too much thinking before the snap. And by the time the snap happens, you're kind of gassed. Your brain fried. It feels like. And so I think if you're going against Georgia, if you're Bill O'Brien, you have to try to go tempo and not allow, because what's going to happen, and we've seen this a lot this year, if there's 3, 4, 5 seconds left on the play clock, the defense knows exactly when you're snapping the football. There's no, you're not going to go on 2 in that situation. So, if you allow Georgia to simply, get that leg up and be able to anticipate snap counts and things like that based off of things that you're doing pre-snap, you're going to, first of all, that puts more pressure on Bryce Young, and also it puts more pressure on your offensive tackles because they have no leverage as far as timing is concerned, because the defense knows when you're snapping it just like So I think that kind of eliminates an advantage that the offensive line naturally has. And I think that's put Alabama's tackles in bad situations at times. But so if I was Bill O'Brien, I'm going tempo. I'm allowing Bryce Young to think a little less and just let his instincts take over. And I think that this offense would run a lot more efficiently. But just anything that you can do when you're already going to be limited, without a run game, you need to be able to do whatever you can to try to slow down that pass rush. And like I said, you haven't seen a lot of screens. You haven't seen a lot of things that really try to, have the pass rush second guess and kind of slow play stuff. They haven't had to worry about that a lot. And so I think that you've got to do that, and you've got to play tempo if you're going to go against this Alabama or this Georgia defense.
Well, and another thing that does is that it forces these same defenders to stay on the field, and it limits Georgia's ability to use its depth. I mean, you've got, several guys that can play, 3, 4 inside linebackers that you can rotate through, at least 4, 5, 6 defensive linemen that are seeing the field every game. And if you're forcing a big guy like Jordan Davis to stay on the field, it puts them in uncomfortable situations. And I think that's what Tennessee did so well, especially early in that game, was they tried to get, Georgia was still trying to substitute in some of those quick changes. And Georgia was not ready to try and defend that Tennessee tempo. Now, I think that Alabama's going to go at that same extreme of the tempo? No, because I think that it's insane what Josh Heupel has done in Knoxville this year and just amping it up, 10 notches there. But I do think that you're right that running tempo against this Georgia defense limits their ability, to, like you said, jump the snap count, know exactly what's coming, but also B, in terms of their depth, it limits their ability to rotate guys in terms of, their ability to get different personnel packages on the field. They like to keep Jordan Davis off the field on third down and get a guy like Jalen Carter in there. Somebody that is maybe a little bit quicker and can get after the passer. They really want Jordan Davis in there first and second down to stop the run and then get him out of there and let guys, go after the passer. If you're going tempo, you can't do that.
Well, and that's fascinating that you said that, because that's a great point. And with Jordan Davis, do you think that his impact on this particular game might be limited a little bit simply because Alabama's not going to be, I don't think, I could be wrong. Maybe they come out and they, maybe Brian Robinson pushes through it and they've got two running backs and somehow they create, 30 carries between the two of them. I just highly doubt that happens. I don't think Alabama is going to try to run the football a lot. You would love for them to attempt it and really try to, bring Georgia's defense up, but I just don't think it's going to happen. I think as far as your run game is concerned, if you're Bryce Young, I know that Alabama is kind of, or at least Bryce Young has wanted to slow play running the football. He does when he has to, and he's very effective at it. But I think he's wanted to limit the amount of hits that he takes because he's already getting a beating from the offensive line that he's got protecting him. But I think in this particular game, with the limitations that you're going to have running the football with your running backs, I think Bryce Young's going to have to use his legs a lot more. You've got to do something to complement what you're trying to do from a passing perspective. But in doing that, if there is limitations with running the football, do you think that Georgia, could Jordan Davis be on the sidelines quite a bit in this football game simply because Alabama's choosing not to run the football?
Yeah, I think that there's absolutely a chance. And I think that, Georgia's going to play Jordan Davis because of the freak of nature that he is in terms of his size and his ability to affect plays, especially if there's, a weakness on the offensive line. A guy like Jordan Davis at his size makes it even that much more difficult to, play up to the standard, rise to the occasion. I think that, but like you said, I think that if Alabama is going to limit its run game, Jordan Davis might very well be limited in terms of how much impact he can have on this game, because he's, we saw him rush down a quarterback against UAB. I don't think he's doing that against Bryce Young. We've seen he's much quicker than he has been, but I think in terms of if you want to put your perfect personnel package out there, and granted, like we said, if Alabama decides to go a little bit tempo, he's going to be forced onto the field in some of these situations. But if you get to dial it up and you get to put whatever personnel package out there, if you're trying to get after a quarterback on 3rd and 10, it's not going to be Jordan Davis that's on the field.
Yeah, I completely. And I don't even know what we're doing as far as time. I normally hold time, and I definitely didn't for this podcast. So I don't even know how we're doing with time, and I don't even know how you guys normally like to do this. But one thing that I did want to touch on just for Alabama fans is I wanted to get your take on Stetson Bennett and just the growth that he's had, because there's a lot of false narratives out there about where he's at as far as being a quarterback. And I can say it until I'm blue in the face, but somebody that literally covers the team, you've seen where he's kind of made progress from last year to this year. A lot of Alabama fans just assume the Stetson Bennett they got in last year's game is going to be the one they get on Saturday. And it's just, that's not going to be who you get. So talk a little bit about Stetson Bennett and how he's been able to grow as a quarterback.
Yeah, I was thinking we typically talk quarterbacks every podcast. For better or for worse, it's been a topic of discussion this season. So I was wondering when the Stetson Bennett question was coming, and figured it was time that we switch over from Alabama's offense versus Georgia's defense to vice versa, Georgia offense versus Alabama defense. I do think that this is a very different Stetson Bennett than the one that took the field in Tuscaloosa last year. I think that he is much more experienced. I mean, he's got a full, pretty much a full season under his belt now, in terms of the starts that he got, probably closer to a season and a half in terms of the starts that he got last year and the starts that he's had this year. He is a much more experienced and comfortable quarterback. When Alabama was facing him, I think that was his third start. It was his third start because he started against Auburn, he started against Tennessee, and of course he came in the first game of the year against Arkansas last season and saved the day for Georgia. So that was his third start of the year, and by his first road start. Now, granted, it it was a COVID situation, and Tuscaloosa was nowhere near what, Bryant-Denny Stadium would be in 2021. But, the atmosphere was very big for him. A primetime game, 2 versus 3. I think that what he did well in that first half was that he didn't try and do too much. And it led to Georgia leading at the half. He was able to move the ball down the field. They were able to run the ball. They were able to throw the ball. They didn't hit on big plays. They took what was given to him. In the second half, after Alabama, after tightened up on defense, got a couple of stops, got a couple of scores on offense, and all of a sudden the tables were turned and Georgia was playing from behind, Stetson felt like he had to make some plays happen. And that's where you saw the costly interceptions. Now, granted, if you go back and you look at his 3 interceptions last year, 2 of them were very, flukish. One of them was a batted ball that, Georgia fans are pretty glad that they haven't seen much this year. Was a little bit of a problem last year in terms of his ability to, as a shorter quarterback. He's probably listed at 5'11". He's probably 5'10" and a half ish. As a shorter quarterback, his ability to get the ball over a bigger offensive line and big defensive linemen who throw their paws up there. I think that, that was a problem for him last year. It hasn't been as much this year. You look at his second interception and went right off the hands of Jermaine Burton, who had several drops in that game. So 2 of his 3 interceptions were not really on him. The third one, he really tried to make too much out of it. Was scrambling around and threw across his body across the middle. And there was no receiver there. I think that what you've seen this year is Stetson is a much more composed quarterback. He knows when to throw the ball away. He knows when to take his check down routes. He knows when to just keep it, try and throw for the sticks rather than try and make a big play. And he also knows when to take off with his legs, because he has been a much more confident runner this year than he was in the past. I think that overall what you're seeing is the experience factor paying off for Stetson Bennett. He's very comfortable with this offense. He's kind of playing, this season like he's got nothing to lose. And I think that he's embraced the game manager role a little bit, where he's not trying to be Joe Burrow. He's not trying to be, somebody that is scrambling around and making plays downfield. He'll take what's given to him. And I think that that's the biggest difference with Stetson Bennett from 2020 to 2021.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. Going back and watching now, I went back and watched a lot of the Georgia game from last year. And that is one of the things that I noticed. And it's something that I went and started to watch. I tweeted about it once I noticed it, was that Alabama did a great job of getting in Stetson Bennett's throwing lanes last year. I think they had 4 batted passes at the line of scrimmage. One of them from DJ Dell ended up getting intercepted by Justin Oboibe on a tip pass. And obviously being able to create turnovers, I think, is huge. I think for Alabama defensively against Georgia's offense, you've got to understand, you got to take a lot of chances. You got to dial some things up. You got to get very aggressive in how you approach it, because if Alabama's offense is going to struggle, against Georgia's defense, I think that the defense for Alabama needs to do whatever they can to put the offense in favorable positions, whether that's creating a turnover with a strip sack, whether that's interceptions, whether that's simply, pinning Georgia deep back in their own territory, making them punt, and Alabama's offense gets the ball at the 50-yard line. Anything that you can do to put the offense in favorable positions, you need to try to do that. And, but with Stetson Bennett, one of the big things from me, now granted, I haven't seen it a ton against, really quality defenses, but he pushes the football downfield a lot better than people realize. And granted, some of that has been, against UAB. I mean, it felt like he averaged 35 yards an attempt in that football game. Looked phenomenal. But, that's something that I think will be interesting, because that has been an area that Alabama has really struggled in at times, is you got coverage breakdowns, deep, that, busted coverages, and teams have been able to exploit that. Tennessee really exploited it. And so I do think that Georgia, with Alabama having such an effective run defense, I could see Georgia trying to push the football downfield as much as possible to open things up, kind of loosen Alabama's defense up. And if Bennett can hit some of those plays, I think that it bodes well for their chances of being able to move the football consistently on offense.
Yeah. And like you said, I think that, with the way that Alabama defends the run so well, just as Georgia does, it makes offenses one-dimensional. I think that Georgia has done a good job of taking what's given to him this year, whether that's been, against Arkansas. I think Bennett threw for 70 yards and they ran for like 288. And then in other games, like you mentioned against UAB, they've aired it out and they've thrown the ball and thrown for 300 plus yards and rushed for not too much. So I think that in terms of what Georgia has done this year so well is it hasn't been completely reliant on one side or the other. They've been able to do both so well, and I think that that's just the general misconception about Georgia. This has been, it's Kirby Smart. They're a run first team. They're going to run, and they're going to rely on it. And that's not the case at all this year. I think that, with Todd Monken as the offensive coordinator, a second year under him, the wide receivers that they've got this year, a second year in this system, they're much more comfortable, airing the ball out than they have been in the past. I think it's going to be interesting to see what role George Pickens plays in this game. I think, with his return to the field last weekend, had one catch for 5 yards, making his return almost just over 8 months after the fact, after he tore his ACL in the spring practice. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of role he has, whether he can actually be a factor or whether they put him out there as a decoy. He demands the respect of a defense just being out there. I think that Jermaine Burton has come a long way for Georgia since that game. Like I mentioned, had a lot of drops last year, but has been a better receiver this year. But they've got other guys that have stepped up. A.D. Mitchell, Ladd McConkey, the tight end Brock Bowers has been phenomenal for the Bulldogs this year as a freshman. So I think that, you look at this Georgia receiver room and it may not be the star-studded group that Alabama has with Williams and Mechie, but they've got reliable guys that understand their role. They're not necessarily taking the top off the defense and beating you deep, but they're going to, pick up 10 to 15 yards per play, in terms of, Bennett's ability to get the ball downfield, push it to the line of scrimmage, and push it to the sticks. I think that, that is certainly something that is underrated. And let's not forget the fact that James Cook and Kenny McIntosh have both been very good options out of the backfield. To me, that has been the biggest difference between Cook of last year and this year. Had the 80-yard touchdown against Alabama last year, had Georgia's last big game, game where they played 4 quarters was against Tennessee. And he had a big one there, career high total for total yards. I think that his ability to mismatch teams and force inside linebackers to cover him, in space is very difficult, puts the pressure on the defense. Now, where I do think Alabama can put the pressure on Georgia is Will Anderson. He's been able to do it for everyone this year, but that's certainly a matchup to watch, especially at left tackle where Georgia has been banged up. Jamari Salyer has missed the last 4 games for the Bulldogs with a foot injury, was dressed out against Tennessee, dressed out against Charleston Southern, went through warmups, but didn't play because they ultimately didn't need him. I think the Tennessee game, Charleston Southern, he was probably able to play, but I think because of the opponent, you don't risk it. Tennessee game, I think that he was just over a week and a half removed from the injury. So I think that they were probably taking it, being cautious with it and saying, hey, we've got a 5-star talent in Broderick Jones that we can throw out there at left tackle. I mean, was the number 10 player in his recruiting class, number 2 offensive tackle. He's played well. And Kirby Smart has said all season that they feel confident in him. It's been a question of whether Georgia wanted to move Salyer in from left tackle into one of the guard spots where he's probably a more natural fit. They haven't done that. They've kept him at left tackle. And I think that that's a testament to the way that he's played at left tackle. Now has, over 15 career starts there, started all last season, with the exception of one game, has started every game that he's played in this year. He started at left tackle. So I think that that's certainly something to watch, whether Salyer is able to suit up. And if not, how Alabama attacks Broderick Jones at that left tackle position.
Yeah, one of the things about Alabama that I don't think a lot of people realize is, early on it was the Will Anderson show. And granted, from a production standpoint, he wasn't doing as well as he's been doing as of late. But I think some of that, now granted, he's just an absolute terror. I mean, he's almost impossible to block, especially one-on-one. But I think what's also helped him is the fact that they've gotten some complementary pass rush, whether it be on the interior or the exterior. You got Fedarian Mathis, who's been fairly consistent as far as being an interior presence. He's good at stopping the run, but he's also been a good interior pass rusher. You got Dallas Turner, who, you had the injury to Christopher Allen in week 1 against Miami. You go to your second string guy, and Trey Sanders. He was solid for Alabama, does a lot of things well, but he's not as good of a pure pass rusher as some of these other guys that Alabama has. And then he gets hurt. You have to start the 5-star true freshman in Dallas Turner. And, he's been a guy early on. I think the defenses, really exploited him. But as of late, he's really started to play a lot better. He's been providing a complimentary pass rush on the opposite side as Will Anderson, and sometimes on the same side, depending on how they line up. And I think that having, multiple players who are difficult to defend or difficult to block, I guess you'd say, has really made Alabama's defense overall a lot more effective. So, I'll be curious. Now, granted, Georgia's offensive line, pretty much across the board, even Broderick Jones, who you mentioned, he's still been a pretty good player. So I don't think Alabama's defensive line has gone against an offensive line that is as good and consistent. Now, granted, early on, I think Georgia struggled up front, but really as of late, it seems like they've been playing a lot better. So I'll be curious to see how that matchup ends up playing out, because everybody's going to look at Georgia's defense against Alabama's offense as the game changer and how this outcome, kind of turns out. I'm kind of looking at it and saying, what is Alabama's defense able to do against Georgia's offense? Because I think that's where Alabama can win, enough matchups to make it. And it just depends on how those matchups are won. If it's simply getting stops, I mean, of course that helps. But like I said, I think it's creating turnovers, it's creating pressures, forcing a bad throw in some kind of way, strip sack, or something like that really helps Alabama. And I guess it's, probably about time to start wrapping this thing up. But from and I guess, if you want to, we can do score predictions, because, I feel pretty confident in what I'm predicting. So do you want to do that next?
Yeah, I haven't thought a ton about my score prediction. I think that this is probably a game that, like we said, Georgia should win on paper. I think that the emotional side of this game is something that plays into Georgia's favor there. I think that, like we said earlier, I think a lot of these seniors, a lot of these guys that are key contributors this year have been played in games against Alabama, whether that's once or twice. Some of these guys were around on the sidelines, at least for that 2018 national championship game of the 2017 season. I think that a lot of these guys are here for this game and are here to beat Alabama. They came to play in games like this. And I think that this is Georgia's best chance that they've had to beat Alabama, both because of what Georgia has and where Alabama has struggled. I think that this is one that probably plays in Georgia's favor. And I think that the defense is able to get some stops. I don't think that they're going to shut out Alabama. I think that Alabama probably puts up the most points that Georgia has given up all season. Now, granted, the most that they've given up all season so far is 17. I'm curious to see if 21 is enough to, make this a close game. To me, I'm thinking probably something along the lines of maybe a 34-21 type game, something in that realm. Haven't necessarily pinned down my score prediction yet, but I do think that Alabama puts up a good fight, probably puts up the most amount of points that Georgia has given up, just because this is probably the best offense that Georgia has played. But I think that, on counterpoint to that is Alabama hasn't played a defense quite like Georgia. And I'm not sure that they've played an offense quite like Georgia as well. So I think that there's going to be more pressure on the Georgia offense in this game than there has been in others, because Alabama is going to be able to score on this Georgia defense. But I think that the overall, the matchups lean Georgia's way, and I would predict a Georgia win.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to predict a Georgia win too, which I haven't done in a very, very long time. But, I think that Alabama I kind of like to range it. I'll nail down a score prediction later on in the week, but as I start working my way through it, I think Alabama's somewhere in that neighborhood of 20-23, and I think Georgia's somewhere in that neighborhood of 20-27. And so, there are scenarios where Alabama, covers. But I more so think it'll be like a 30-23 or a 27-20 type of game. Definitely not taking the over. I don't remember what it was at, but I want to say it was in the high 50s. And if that's the case, I mean, I'm not touching that. But I do think that Georgia, if it stays at 6.5, I could see them winning by a touchdown. And I do think that it's kept relatively close. I think Alabama will have a good game plan. I think they'll take a lot of chances. And I think that, maybe they can do some things early that maybe Georgia's not expecting and get some big breaks. But ultimately, I think that Georgia's defense is able to force, because Alabama's offense is going to be so limited and one-dimensional. I think they're able to force, some mistakes, and they're able to capitalize on those like they have in pretty much a lot of these other games they've participated in. So I do think that it'll be a good game. I think it'll be a fun game to watch. But ultimately, on paper, if I were to pick Alabama, it would be extremely emotional based. And while I do think that Alabama, having this huge chip on their shoulder, is going to come in motivated because they haven't been in that position in so long, if they were playing any other team, I'd give that a lot more attention. But the fact they're playing Georgia, and Georgia's going to have its own set of motivation with the fact that, with the way that these games have played out in the past, or the recent games, it's very tough for me to say that Georgia's going to come in flat and not be motivated themselves. So if both teams are playing at their best, I do think it's a war. But I ultimately think Georgia's going to come out on top. So that's going to do it for today's episode. Palmer, this has been a blast, man. I can do this with you every week. I wish Alabama was playing Georgia every week, because it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, Clint, certainly appreciate making this crossover happen, and look forward to seeing you in Atlanta on Saturday.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Looking forward to it as well. Once again, this has been Clint Lamb with the Bama On3 show, and then Palmer Thombs with Dawg Walk Talk. This has been a crossover podcast talking about the Alabama-Georgia game, and we'll see what happens on Saturday. Appreciate you, Palmer.